History provides valuable lessons. Today's leaders might want to turn their clocks back 1,000 years for a particularly good lesson. That's the recommendation from John Sanders, Senior Fellow in Regulatory Studies and Research Editor at the John Locke Foundation. And John, you think that today's leaders, President Biden, Governor Cooper, others in major positions of power, could adopt Canute thinking. Who's Canute, and why should people think like him?
Yes. King Canute was a Viking leader and also the King of England in the 11th century. And I encountered the story of Canute years ago cleaning out my great-aunt's library books. And I found this ancient book that had this picture of this king standing in the surf with his arms standing out. And I thought, what in the world is that? And that's how I encountered the legend of King Canute. So essentially, the legend is this. King Canute was getting really bored of his fawning courtiers telling him, "Oh, great king, you can do anything. You are the leader. You are the commander of all. You can command everything." And so he decided to teach them a lesson in the actual limits of his power as a man. So he had his chair, his throne, brought down to the seashore, and he famously commanded the tide to recede because he is the great king and commander of all. And of course, you can't do that. The tide wouldn't listen, and the tide came in. And depending on which version of the legend that you read, and I like David Hume's version, the philosopher who also wrote A History of England. But he turned around and said to them, "See, these will only obey the great Creator and not an earthly king."
In fact, you write about this and say that the king said that every creature in the universe was feeble and impotent, and the power resided with one being alone, in whose hands were all the elements of nature. Not in the hands of the king, but in the hands of the Creator.
Right.
So before we get into how this could apply to today's leaders 1,000 years later, it's interesting to note some people think of the King Canute story and take the opposite lesson, that Canute thought he had the power. You're telling us he knew he didn't have the power. He was teaching the rest of the people who were around him and flattering him so much that he didn't have power.
Right. The original story of Canute came from, it was written in the 12th century, and I've forgotten the gentleman's name, the history of England at that point in time. And yes, the idea at the time was that Canute, whether or not this actually happened, I mean, this is a fairly legend story, it's probably apocryphal, but it was to prove that he did not have that kind of power. But it has been taken since then, although I don't see that too often referenced in America. It's probably more an English thing, is the idea that the king has lost his mind and thinks he can even command the tide.
Well, speaking of losing minds, or at least getting closer to that point, you tell this story not just because it's a fun story, but because today's political leaders could use Canute thinking. How would you apply what Canute said in this legend to what President Biden, Governor Cooper, other leaders should be doing today?
Well, the idea behind the column kind of came from President Biden criticizing the governors of Texas and Mississippi and some others for rolling back their COVID restrictions. And he accused them of Neanderthal thinking, the idea being that these restrictions are the only way that we can stop the progression of the virus. Whereas these governors apparently perceived, rightly in my view, that we were on the tail end of seasonality, and this is when flu and cold viruses tend to peter out. And so the results since then, and they are still that way, as cases have continued to drop pretty precipitously in both of those states and others, and also in states that have all of the government, the lockdowns and the masks orders and all of these things, because the virus is a natural phenomenon, and it is not obeying government orders.
Yeah, and you warn at the near the end of your column that it's not just that the forces of nature don't obey the politicians, but the governed who believe otherwise are simpletons, while the ruler who acts on that belief is destined to be a frustrated tyrant exposed as a fraud. No one should want that, right?
Gosh, I would hope not. But we do see, at least locally, there's a revealed preference for that.
Well, if you'd like to learn more, you can go to the website of the American Institute for Economic Research and find the column with the headline, Biden and the Lockdown Governors Need Canute Thinking. Or you can go to the John Locke Foundation's Locker Room blog and find a similar post, Biden, Cooper et al. Need Canute Thinking. Its author is John Sanders, Senior Fellow in Regulatory Studies and Research Editor at the John Locke Foundation. John, thanks so much.
Thank you.